exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what Kung Fu Podcast is all about, and I'm your host, T.W. Smith. Thank you so very much for joining me today in an episode where we're going to put a close to this research biography of Sun Lu Tang. This particular episode is going to be coming out a little bit later than normal, and I wanted to share with you some of the reasons why and why it's kind of important to all of us in many different ways. During this past week, I had been training with a student, and he's been with me now for a couple of years. And this past Thursday, we had a real good workout. We worked out on some Lama Kung Fu, did some Tai Chi Chuan and meditation. And then a few days later, I get a phone call, and they let me know how much his martial arts practice meant to him, but that he had passed away. Totally unexpected, not a sign anywhere in the world. It's really difficult when you lose a friend. And it's even more so, and one of the things that if you ever get to a place to where you're a martial arts instructor, when you lose someone who's a friend, someone who makes an incredibly good effort every time they come in, each time they walk in the door, they bring an attitude that is something you like to be around. It's something that you try to invest in and trying to help them move forward, which is also kind of an extension of yourself. And I can tell you, from a martial arts instructor standpoint, skill levels never, ever trump great attitudes. It is so difficult at times to find people who will face their challenges, work, grimace, smile, do whatever's necessary to get themselves to a different place. And his passing reminded me to remind all of us, never put rank, grade, or performance in front of people who have great effort, outstanding attitudes, and are always willing to help one another. Those things cannot be replaced. And Curtis was that type of student, the type of practitioner that any student of any style would have gained something by training with him. Going to miss you, my friend. If this is your first time to Kung Fu Podcast, welcome to the program. You're in the audience to some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world, folks who take a great deal of care and effort in their craft. Just like those folks who participate in the Shuri-Te Association, who are going to come down and see me, Paul Cody, Troy Price on September the 2nd down at Myrtle Beach. And then to let you know, I will also be down in Dallas, North Carolina for the Shuri-Te Martial Arts Seminar in November of 2017. If you'd like to find out more information about those programs coming up, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/Shuri-Te. In the last episode, we took a detailed look at Sun Lu Tang's first instructor, Master Wu. Then we took his other instructors, Zhang and Li, and looked at how they were honing his Xingyi skills and his literary and philosophical skills and understandings at the same time. I would suggest that you go and begin with the first episode in this series, mostly because you get to meet so many interesting personalities. You get to see how Sun Lu Tang developed as a martial artist. But perhaps most importantly, you begin to see where this concept of traditional martial arts was actually started, as we think of it today, in the early 1900s. But the traditional martial arts actually began much, much further back than the 1900s. These episodes are based around the essays written by Dr. Ben Junkins over at Kung Fu Tea, and you can find Ben's work by going to kungfupodcast.com/Ben. So now let's move forward in the following of Sun Lu Tang as he heads to the mountains of philosophy. Things changed radically for Sun Lu Tang at the end of his formal Xingyi training. His teacher, Li, referred him to his own teacher in Beijing, whose name was Gao, with whom he had practiced Xingyi with for about 8 years. Gao later referred Sun to his friend and fellow martial arts teacher, Chung Ting Hao, a second-generation Bakwa master. Cheng had received his Bakwa from Dong Hai Tuan. Now, while Dong claimed to have learned his style from a mysterious wandering holy man, most modern martial arts historians credit Dong with the creation of this style. Cheng had a fearsome fighting reputation, and that alone probably would have been sufficient to attract Sun Lu Tang. Let us also remember that Sun was no longer a young man when he first took up Bakwa. Depending upon how you date his birth, he was already in his late 20s or possibly 30 years old. Being a professional martial artist at the turn of the century was a very strenuous affair. Injuries would accumulate, and medical care was not great anywhere in the world. Think about it for a moment. Even today, with the medical care standards up higher than hopefully it was in the 1900s, even today a fighter or a professional athlete will be considered past their prime at the age of 30. This is true for every martial artist, whether they're in the United States, China, Japan, Thailand, it doesn't matter. Now, that's notwithstanding those who happen to have the amazing chi powers. But for Sun Lu Tang, it was clearly the time to settle down and start a business. Perhaps something like a guard company or a school. Sun Lu Tang was engaged. He had some prospects in his life, and yet something seemed to be driving him onward. With Cheng, his quest was refracted in a slightly different direction. And this is where Sun discovers the Taoist roots of Bakwa. Cheng was impressed with Sun and agreed to teach him. The two studied together for 3 years, until Cheng pronounced that Sun's martial education was complete with him. And at that point, Cheng advised his student to go out into the world and live the life of a martial artist, gaining the sort of experience that can only come from doing rather than from learning. Sun's daughter reports that he was reluctant to leave at the time and obtained the following piece of advice from his teacher Cheng, who said, "If you want to climb the holy platform, it is necessary for you to study the origin and understand the principle of the I Ching. I know that there are some people in the Sichuan province who are especially skilled at these theories. You should travel there." Well, doesn't that seem like an odd bit of advice to give a martial arts student who's looking to improve his boxing skills and his footwork? Why would understanding the origins of the I Ching, a book of omens, and one of the oldest books in the Chinese literary canon, be of any value to a martial artist? Taoist sages and scholars studied the I Ching, but very few serious scholars were ever martial artists. Now, wandering Taoist holy men, this was a totally different matter. Many of them would use the marketplace demonstrations like Wu to sell medicine and amulets, or to build up a congregational following. Yet, these were not the type of individuals that Cheng was concerned with. There's also a slightly more interesting question that needs to be asked at this point. Why did Cheng send Sun Lu Tang to Sichuan? Much is made of the decline of Taoism as a social movement and philosophical tool during the Qing and Republic periods of China. The Ming emperors had actually supported certain branches of Taoism and have built up the Wudong Temple complex as a family sanctuary and as a retreat. Unfortunately, many subsequent scholars blamed a reliance on mysticism and magic for the fall of the Ming. Official Qing orthodoxy was strongly Confucian, and it was quite hostile to anything non-rational. While the state tolerated Buddhism, Taoism lost much of its luster and institutional support. A frequently cited statistic states that by the end of the Qing dynasty, only one complete collection of Taoist scriptures remained in all of China, and that was at Wudong. Author Vincent Goussart, who wrote The Taoists of Peking, 1800 through 1949, A Social History of Urban Clerics, has done an incredibly good job of reconstructing exactly what the Taoist religious and social element of Beijing was like while Sun Lu Tang was studying Bakwa in the capital. There was an incredibly complex network of temples, teachers, mystics and ritualists spread across the city of Beijing. To paraphrase Mark Twain, the death of urban Taoism during the Qing dynasty appears to have been greatly exaggerated. There were quite literally dozens, if not hundreds, of teachers who could have initiated Sun Lutang into the mysteries of the I Ching and immortality right there in Beijing. So why was he being told to go to Sichuan? Well, let's consider for a moment. Sacred mountains and pilgrimage to sacred mountains have long been an important part of Chinese culture. And let's not forget that Cheng wanted his student to get out and finally see the world. You remember the type of experiences that you only get by doing, not by learning, so you got to get out there and get out of the nest and start flying at some point. But maybe there was something else more to his advice. To begin with, Cheng probably knew his teacher well enough to be very suspicious about his many evasive accounts of where Bakwa originated. In fact, it is quite likely that Cheng guessed that the origin of his teacher style, which was characterized by unique circular forms, had something to do with his earlier wanderings in Sichuan province, long before he ever came to the capital and became a noted martial arts instructor. Well, if we take a moment and look at another prominent martial arts researcher's work, whose name is Professor Kang Wu, you will find that he is the most respected source on all of Bakwa's origins. Kennedy and Gao, whose books you can find over at the Kung Fu Diehard Library, provide a brief biography and overview of his career if you're more interested in learning about Professor Kang. In short, Professor Kang, while he was conducting his research for his master's thesis, traveled extensively throughout the country and collected literally hundreds of interviews and documents. His reconstruction of Dong's life is not without gaps and questions, but it is the most widely accepted one that we have from a historian and a researcher. And of course, it should be noted that not all the lineages of the Bakwa clan agree with Professor Kang's claims. So let's take a quick moment and have a lineage alert. As we have stated many times on this program, lineages do not represent history. They are much as about political aspirations, legends, myths. They're used as economical tools just as much, if not more so, than they're actually used as a historical overview. It's important to remember that when history changes and you learn about something new, like a new fact or a new artifact, you adjust your perspectives of history with it. Lineages won't change. In fact, they will get evolved and moved around in ways that people who were participating in the programs get eliminated because they're no longer in the good graces of the so-called Grand Master or the other politics who are involved, or you have these new lineages pop up along the way because they found some mystical connection to another lineage. Anyway, just remember, when it comes to lineages, take them with a major grain of salt. But when it comes to Bakwa and to Dong, it's probably good to know that he was born in Jujiawu Township in Wenhan County, which was sometime around 1813. By his own admission, he disliked farm work and was not content with living the life of a peasant. So instead, Dong threw himself into the studies of various local fighting styles. Eventually, he ran afoul of a local gentry family and was forced to flee his home village in 1853. That would have made him 40, right? So about the same time that Wu was on the road and finding the adventures and as well the Taiping Rebellion. It seems that Dong's first stop was with a branch of his own family in Kaikou village, where he stayed with his cousin Dong Shenjiao, who was a very well-known, skilled martial artist. And this is where Dong apparently studied Ba Fa Quan. Now, Professor Kang believes that it was Dong's introduction to Ba Fa Quan that was the critical step in the development of Bakwa, and that many of the specific movements from his cousin's styles can still be clearly seen in the composite of the art that we call Bakwa to this day. Professor Kang reports that Dong continued his journey and he kept heading south. He also stopped at a number of places like Jiangsu and Zhejiang before he came to the Da Ba mountain area on the border of Sichuan province. Somewhere in this journey, possibly in Sichuan, Dong is reported to have joined a Taoist religious movement. Professor Kang claims specifically that he became associated with the Longmen Dragon Gate School of Complete Reality Taoism. This is a venerable system of Taoist mystical thought and practice going back to the Northern Sung Dynasty. Quan Shin, the Complete Reality Taoism philosophy and practice, is very rich. But that in itself creates a problem for us. We have no evidence that indicates that Dong was either literate or had much of an education either. So in that sense, it is hard to know what precisely he would have learned from his teachers. It seems that a lot more of the complicated theoretical discussion would have been difficult. For instance, while Dong uses the imagery of the 8 trigrams of the I Ching, the Bakwa, Professor Kang doesn't find any evidence that this device actually provided a theoretical foundation for his later art. It seems that the 8 trigrams was adopted inside of the Bakwa more for its symbolic value. It also seems more likely that Dong would have been involved with this group on a more of a communal and ritual level. And that in turn is quite interesting, as the Longmen section of Taoism sometimes practices a form of moving meditation called circle walking. While in addition to walking the circle, this exercise also involves the use of mantras and mindfulness. Professor Kang ultimately concludes that this is the source of Dong's unique style that we now call Bakwa. After returning to Beijing, Dong combined the boxing elements that he had learned from his cousin, and likely other earlier teachers, with the circle walking he had mastered in the Southwest, and created this art that we now refer to as Bakwa. However, and interestingly enough, Dong never claimed to be the founder of the style. Instead, what he did is he claimed to have received the art from a wandering holy man. Of course, Dong also claims to have been a court eunuch as well, and quite a few other things in his past that most martial arts historians now reject as never being true. In fact, Dong was well known to have been remarkably evasive when discussing his past or the origins of his martial arts style. Apparently, Chung knew enough about his teacher's past to realize that there was some sort of connection between the actual study of Taoism and the initial creation of Bakwa. It was also easy to suspect that this probably happened in the Sichuan province, and this is why he advised Sun Lu Tang, who was his better educated and prepared student, to focus on the search for his answers on Taoism, and to do it by looking into the Southwest. The good news is that Sun's travels were better documented than Dong's. The bad news is that his journal was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. If it wasn't, we would have a very detailed understanding of his investigation. But even without it, we do know a lot of critical facts. For example, after a multi-year delay, he was able to travel to the famous Mount Yimei in Sichuan province in 1894. And this is where he met and became the student of a teacher named Shi Jin. With him, Sun studied the origins and theory of the I Ching, and as well, he practiced and learned Yimei Shan Qigong. This is an extremely important note because this is also most likely quite a bit different from what Dong had studied while he was working with the Longmen sect. While on his return, Sun took the opportunity to stop at Mount Wudong. The temple complex there has long been an important site for Taoist learning and as well has received extensive patronage during the Ming Dynasty. Sun Lu Tang remained in the area for 2 years, and this is where he studied the arts of immortality, which is building us up to the development of Sun Lu Tang's own Taoist synthesis. And this is where you're going to see that after returning to his home near Baoding in 1896, Sun established a commercial teaching organization, the Puyang Boxing Association. It is not known how much of his Taoist instruction was integrated into his teaching of this period, but most likely not very much of it was. And then in only 3 short years, Sun is forced to abandon the area of Baoding to move to a safer location because of the up-and-coming Boxer Rebellion. It is possible that Sun may have integrated some of his own theories of Taoism into his martial arts during the Qing-Tang period, but we have no evidence that directly testifies to it. It is only after Sun moves to Beijing in 1910 that we start to really have well-attested evidence that his synthesis of Taoist theory and martial arts practice have begun to mature into a form that we know of today. This is interestingly coincidental, because this is also the time period where Sun Lu Tang is introduced to Tai Chi. So we're left to wonder, to what extent did this new style called Tai Chi spur Sun into further synthesizing and rethinking the elements of his martial and philosophical education? Sun's first publication on Xing Yi came out in 1915. It was a remarkable work for its time, providing relatively comprehensive explanations of the art with lots of clear photography. It was designed so that an individual or even a small group could read the explanations, study the form, and work out together a few times a week, and that they could actually make some real progress in the art over the course of a few years. His subsequent books followed roughly the same pattern. But if you've never read one of Sun Lu Tang's books, they're not only a beginner's guide to the martial arts, they're also a basic introduction to practical Taoism. Sun believed that the inner instinct employed to anticipate and react in martial arts was of the same root as the Wei, the Tao in Taoism. This method of anticipating and dealing with change was a creation of the ancient sages, who in turn created the first internal boxing methods. These methods depended upon a highly developed sense of intuition, which in itself is an extension of the survival instinct, and encouraged the flow and transformation of qi, and thus good health, which, unlike the external martial arts, that was said to have relied exclusively on brute muscular strength. In the introduction to a study of Tai Chi Chuan, Sun provides this revealing history of Chinese martial arts. In his view, these arts were first created as a method of combining stillness and motion so that the insubstantial qi could be recovered. And at this moment, earlier we had a lineage alert, let me now give us a legend and myth alert, because this is where theories, legends, and myths are going to begin to collide together. And instead of reading you Ben's thoughts on what Sun Lu Tang had wrote, let me share with you Sun Lu Tang's writing, the Brennan translation, so that you can begin to sense what was being published and pushed out. Paul Brennan translates, quote, "As the active aspect wanes, the passive aspect flourishes, and then the 6 kinds of atmospheres affect us: windy, cold, hot, damp, dry, and smoky. And then also the 7 kinds of emotions are felt: joy, rage, worry, obsessiveness, grief, fear, and shock. The body gets increasingly weakened, and illness repeatedly arises." Ancient people worried about this, and so they experimented with medicines to dispel their ailments and silent meditations to nourish their minds. They also wondered whether movement and stillness could not be used together, and so they also invented boxing arts in order to seek a restoration of their natural energy. Later, when Damo traveled to the east to share the way, he came to the Shaolin Temple in Henan. He worried the monks were damaging their spirit from sitting in extended meditation, for they appeared haggard and emaciate. Therefore, he put forth the theory of smoothness and coarseness, of passive and active. He explained about the primal energy of the innate condition, and wrote the Sinu Changing Classic and Morrow Washing Classic to teach people how to practice in order to invigorate their bodies. Then in the Song Dynasty, Yu Fei built upon the essence of the 2 classics, creating the Xing Yi boxing, suitable for practical use, and the principles of Bakwa boxing were also contained within them. This was the origin of the boxing arts of the internal school. In the Yuan dynasty, during the reign of Emperor Shundi, Zhang Sanfang, a Taoist of Wudong, noticed that those who were both cultivating elixir and practicing the boxing arts were using an inappropriate degree of acquired strength, and thus were unable to achieve an energy of centered harmoniousness, which results in harm to their elixir and a diminishing of their primal energy. Thus he abided by the principles of the sinew changing and marrow washing classics, applied the form of Zhao Danyi's explanations of the Tai Chi diagram, seized upon the theory in the He River diagram and Lao River document, as well as the reasoning from the Book of Changes, adopting their mentality of naturalness, and made the Tai Chi boxing art, revealing the secrets of nurturing the body." End quote. Now, I didn't count, and I probably should have, the number of myths and legends that you just heard. Most of those have been discounted, both from not just Western historians and anthropologists, but also Asian historians, researchers, and anthropologists. But what was really interesting in the story is that all these myths and legends were blended into the theories that have long been existing with just enough martial arts behind it to make it have a palatability to it. Dr. Ben Junkin's summary of it is this: Sun did not believe that the routines from Damo were meant to be martial in nature at all, merely beneficial for health. Then Sun tells us that it was Yu Fei, the famous general of Chinese military lore, who later studied these classical physical and breathing exercises and began to understand their true nature. It was the legendary Yu Fei who modified the forms, adding their martial applications, and created Xingyi. Then Sun goes on to claim that Bakwa is a derivative art of that. Whereas Professor Kong felt Bakwa was derived from Ba Fa, Sun instead saw many similarities into Xingyi, which is understandable considering that Sun's lifelong study of Xingyi would have made him very sensitive to any parallels between these two arts. These internal arts, according to Sun, are the result of a Chinese general modifying the health sets that were created by a Buddhist patriarch to solve an age-old dilemma in Taoist mysticism and alchemy. Then Sun continues and provides a separate lineage for the various branches of Tai Chi. Like most other martial arts of this period, he believed that Tai Chi was created by the mystical recluse Zhang Sanfang on the mountain of Wudong. Having overexerted himself in the study of the external martial arts, Zhang had damaged his qi. To recuperate, he studied the tendon-changing and marrow-washing classics. And as well, he studied Zhao Zi's Tai Chi symbol. And as legend has it, as he is synthesizing these two bodies of information, he begins to understand the system that regulated the flow of qi between its pre-birth and post-birth states, and he invented the art of Tai Chi Chuan. Well, needless to say, there is a massive amount that we can draw out of these stories. But the most critical aspect in both cases is that Sun believed that the practices that we now refer to as the internal martial arts began with the Taoist health and longevity practice that were first studied in the Holy Mountains. This knowledge was either lost or missing from the so-called external styles. And interestingly enough, according to Sun, some aspect of this crucial knowledge of spiritual mysteries was also shared by Taoism, Buddhism, and even Confucianism. So let's take a moment here and just put a pause on the spiritual mysteries and legends so that you and I can stay together. It really is important to understand that there has always been an internal and external component of martial arts. It is very simple. How we think about what we're doing matters a lot to how it comes out. The internal is what you can't see. When you're exercising focus as compared to awareness? Are you practicing cleverness? Are you exercising strategies? Are you holding true to your objectives? These are all things that you can't see how the person's doing, but that's the internal components. What about confidence? Can somebody put their confidence on a plate and show it to you? Of course not. That's inside. But it affects what you see on the outside, the external. In Chinese martial arts, increasing speed for example, is an internal component. It is the removal of the distance between your thought and the action. The closer your thought is to your action, the more appropriate in your speed you're going to be. In athletics, it's called the flow. You begin to move as if things are almost happening in slow motion. A gentleman who I've read quite a bit about in these past 2 weeks is Dr. Dennis Arthey. And he wrote, as a martial arts concept, external force is based on these concept images which directly relate to muscular and physical force and strength, whether it's gentle or brute. The martial concept of internal force is related to technique, biomechanics, leverage, coordination, posture, mind focus, and martial concepts such as borrowing the opponent's force through yielding, deflecting, sticking, and push-pull techniques. Accordingly, within the context of Tai Chi as a martial art, there is nothing mystical or magical about internal power. As part of this involves learning how to use your mind and body and those connections to maximize the use of a technique for the intention of defeating or stopping the enemy. Internal power, therefore, is a metaphor to describe a range of techniques designed to increase leverage, to limit the use of external force, or to govern the effort of external force for the sole purpose of achieving a successful outcome. A smaller person properly trained with some internal understandings is able to defeat a larger, much stronger opponent in combat, not by using this physical force and power, but through the leverage and understanding of the smaller combatant's superior skills. Within the context of Tai Chi Chuan as a martial art, to achieve the outcome of defeating your enemy demands a combination of physical power with an appropriate level of skill and technique sufficient to neutralize or defeat the enemy's combined use of so-called internal and external forces. An ancient Chinese man said, Wu Qi, then Tai Chi. Not only in the martial arts is this so, it extends to the Confucianists, who called it holding to the center, to the Buddhists, who called it that round feeling, and to the Taoists, who called it the valley spirit. Although these names are different, all come from this approach. Therefore, the internal martial arts truly are with Taoism the exterior and interior of each other, and are not merely a means of cultivating health and prolonging life." End quote. According to Ben, this is the framework that led Sun to claim that rather than being a minor or secondary consideration, that self-cultivation and the health aspect of the martial arts were central to the entire enterprise. They were the literal heart of the matter. Once you mastered these skills, other martial applications could be sought and added. But in Sun's view, pursuing the combative skills first was like putting the cart before the horse. And this was it. Sun Lu Tang was now free to build a vast synthesis of his martial and Taoist knowledge. He used his philosophical understanding as the theoretical framework to order his introduction and understanding of martial knowledge. What we see here is a switch in his approach from an inductive model to a deductive model. We have gone from a situation in which many individuals saw and wondered about parallels to one in which the philosophical theories were now presumed to be the dominant in political and social context, and then the applications of the martial arts techniques were modified to fit into those philosophical theories, which is going to bring us to Sun Lu Tang's intellectual legacy in the Republic of China. Sun's books not only helped to spread and popularize Tai Chi and Bakua, they also helped to reignite the public interest in Taoism. More specifically, he helped to popularize the sorts of breathing exercises that later would be systemized into Qigong during the 1950s. Sun was very fortunate in terms of timing. The nation was concerned about imperialism and foreign encroachment in the early 20th century. Political leaders sought to address these questions on a number of levels. Some of these efforts included reforming education, as well as improving the public health and physical strength of the Chinese people as a whole. Many martial arts reformers, including the Jingwu Association, were publicly arguing both of these problems could be addressed by introducing some sort of modernized martial arts curriculum into primary and secondary school education. They also argued that the martial arts should be part of education reform because they would help to literally strengthen the nation, both in physical and spiritual terms. Occasionally, reformers would point to the success of Budo in Japan to illustrate what might be possible in China. Of course, these martial arts could not be the old-style hands of combat of the Qing dynasty, taught in very narrow secretive networks. This new age demands a reform and open arts that can be shared with the entire nation. To be taught in large classes, styles needed to focus on forms rather than personalized instruction. Also important in these large groups, combat applications did need to be a major focus of the early phases of training. So, this environment was primed and ready for Sun Lutang's ideas. They appreciated his simplified forms, open publications, and emphasis on health and self-cultivation. These same traits also made his work accessible to out-of-shape, middle-class professionals who were interested in traditional boxing, but needed a social rationale that would justify them picking up such a questionable pursuit. Sun gave lectures and taught classes on philosophy that would have been very appealing to exactly this demographic. You should know that Sun was far from the only voice in this field. Newspapers and magazines during this period were full of articles with ideas about how the nation's physical culture should be reformed. The martial artists who had been badly damaged by the Boxer Uprising and then the ending of the military service exam in 1905, these guys and gals needed to use this burst of interest to modernize their arts, and they argued for their continuing relevance. Andrew Morris, who we've referenced several times on this program, documented this very nicely in his book that you can find at the Kung Fu Podcast Library, Morrow of the Nation, A History of Sport and Physical Culture in Republic in China. And if you want to hear the stories that book was referenced in greater detail, go to Kung Fu Podcast episodes 114 through 116 just by going to kungfupodcast.com/114. So what separated Sun from these other newspapers that want to reform physical culture, from the Jingwu Association, from the other martial artists who wanted to, disconnect themselves from the whole Boxer Uprising thing? What made Sun Lutang different from these other reformers was his interest in the traditional Taoist philosophy. The traditional martial arts could have gone in a lot of different directions during the 1920s and 30s. While some ideas, such as the need to end this form of secrecy, was held widely among the various reformers, other ideas were much more controversial. For example, some of these voices were advocating the rebuilding of the martial arts along the lines of modern Western sciences, while other writers thought that the road to salvation in the martial arts lay in creating bayonet and sword routines that would appeal to the military. Most of the reformers of this period would have found Sun Lutang's interest in Taoism and longevity practices to be superstitious and counterproductive. Yet and still, this approach proved to be the one that was most popular with a large chunk of the increasingly urban population. If nothing else, this review has shown that Sun Lutang's reformation of the traditional martial arts into a Taoist enterprise did not happen in a vacuum. He was surrounded by other martial artists who also had questions about the same topics that he did, and a couple had even tried to fuse together these principles in the past, like Master Dong and Bakwa. But rather than reconnecting with the specialist literature on the martial arts or Qigong and philosophy that arose in the late Ming Dynasty, Sun embarked on his own investigation and he drew his own conclusions. His synthesis was simple enough that it could be picked up and practiced by a non-specialist, introducing them to some elements of both the traditional martial arts and Qigong. but it was also complex enough to open up a world of possibilities for future exploration. After Sun, there were a number of other manuals published that also integrated the internal martial arts and Taoism. While Sun was first to publish on this topic, it does not appear that he was the only one thinking about it. But he did set a very high standard for subsequent authors, and this helped to improve the overall quality of writing in the Chinese martial arts. Which brings us to Sun Lu Tang and the current state of traditional Chinese martial arts. The traditional Chinese martial arts may have started out as a method for fighting, but in the post-World War II period, they quickly became a means of identity formation. It is not that the need for self-defense has ever really gone away, but other, less tangible concerns have risen to the forefront. For displaced refugees in Taiwan and Hong Kong following the 1949 takeover, questions about what it meant to be Chinese while living in exile became critical. The Cultural Revolution and its aftermath left a generation of young people in mainland China struggling to find their way in the world. Likewise, the martial arts in the West are often tied to a desire to self-create a new identity. Sun's philosophy, which did not please many of the reformers during the 1920s and 30s, now started to serve a new purpose for a new generation of martial artists. It seemed to embody those ancient values that ensured a sense of authenticity and rootedness. In this ever-drifting age of globalization, Sun's ideas have come to represent values that many individuals around the world are actively seeking even today. It may surprise you that Sun is not always regarded as a very skilled and certainly not great martial artist in China. This is particularly true among competing Tai Chi, Xingyi, or Bakwa lineages. His modification and simplification of the forms are not always appreciated. The emphasis on health and basic fitness, rather than actual fighting and self-defense applications, are often questioned. And most of us practical martial artists can understand that. Ben stated in the beginning of this research biography that he is not part of the Tai Chi or Neijia community, that his own martial arts that he tends to practice, Wing Chun, is almost devoid of any philosophical discussion. I'd also like to remind you that Tang Hao, a man who I would love to have met, he was a martial artist, he was a lawyer, and basically is known as the original Chinese martial arts historian, argued against these blending of legends and myths into the martial arts. Tang Hao and his positions that he would take in his voice ended up getting him pulled in and tortured. And if you want to hear more about that, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/34. And then there's Mr. Adam Shu, one of my favorites of the original traditional Chinese martial arts, said that men were putting philosophy where skills belong. But Ben continues by saying that that does not mean that martial arts in itself cannot improve health or lead to self-cultivation. But for the most part, these other things are basically byproducts of strenuous training in an environment where one is highly motivated and focused anyway. Plus, in the martial arts, if you stop being focused, you're likely to get punched in the head or thrown to the ground. Nothing focuses the mind quite like the desire not to get hit or have your ass handed to you. As pragmatic and practical martial artists, we should worry about what will happen to the martial arts if that primal motivation is ever taken away. If spiritual discipline is really your primary goal, why not just skip the middleman and become a Longmen Taoist in the first place? If the martial arts are really about health and fitness, why don't we do yoga instead? One of the concerns for the traditional Chinese martial arts is that in an era of intense economic modernization, the traditional martial arts might lose some essential part of their original spirit. It's also important to add that this is also true if the martial arts are tilted strictly to sports such as MMA and always put into the illegal street fighting contexts. From a practical perspective, Sun Lu Tang's theories and philosophies is problematic because he starts to make the martial arts secondary to a philosophical practice, and in doing so, makes the martial arts an epiphenomenon. When you begin to look at an epiphenomenon, they can go a little too far on the philosophical side, pseudosciences, quantum physics, and all this other stuff. An epiphenomenon is something that occurs while you are focused on something else. Sun Lu Tang's narrative can give you the impression that emphasizing your philosophical practice will make your martial arts better. And that's kind of ass backwards. A little education is very helpful. Understanding is very useful. But you can't think a mule down a field or improve your combative training by thinking about it. You've got to experience more and think less. You've got to get down to a place where things are physically moving in the way that you're planning to implement them. And with all that, that is still not the real problem. The real issue is Sun Lu Tang's larger point. You know, martial arts applications come and go. Individual martial arts are created and then they get forgotten. Yet there is a continuity here more than you may see on the surface. For example, a number of important Wing Chun masters have attempted to integrate some of Sun Lu Tang's basic reforms into their art. Being a highly decentralized tradition, these individual efforts have not been quick to spread. But it is easy to see how this basic project can be adopted from one type of system to the next. And perhaps this should not be a surprise. In fact, it can even create some great questions. Sun's basic propositions were not and are not universally accepted. And what that means is that it's not hard to find individuals who disagree with Sun Lu Tang's principles. However, the propositions that Sun made are about as widely held as any other set of ideas that we have in the traditional Chinese martial arts today. And this is where we would want to watch out for future developments in the martial arts, becoming aware and cautious of trends, because what will his impact be in the future? Will we continue to see the spread of these ideas? Will Wing Chun and the other traditional Chinese martial arts that initially had nothing to do with Sun Lu Tang continue to become closed communities focused on health and identity formation? Or will we see an increasing bifurcation in the hand of the combat community? A division between those who view practice as being fundamentally about health and philosophy and those that reject this as an early 20th century project. While Sun's legacy is also mixed in the field of Chinese martial studies, it is clear he was an important author and an innovative practitioner. Yet, the more closely we look at Sun, the more individuals we find with a shared interest. Sun's synthesis of Taoism and the martial arts was his own unique creation, but his life and subsequent reaction to his works show that there were both a number of individuals both asking similar questions and that there was a real general hunger among a large number of practitioners from this sort of discourse. In that way, carefully examining Sun Lu Tang's life helps us to move beyond the more superficial level of questions. Clearly, the working class individuals were capable of having aspirations for culture and self-cultivation, just like everyone else in Chinese society. Perhaps rather than asking whether the Chinese martial arts were ever related to Buddhism or Taoism to any degree, it is time to reformulate our research questions. For example, why were some Chinese martial artists in the 1920s and 30s enamored with the idea of finding a link to a possible ancient alchemic practice, while others insisted that such superstitions needed to be abandoned if the traditional martial arts were going to be saved? How have questions of economic class and education interacted to affect the relationship between spirituality and the martial arts? We rarely discuss it now, but there were a number of wealthy scholars who collected swords and other important artifacts during the Qing dynasty. They probably had some thoughts on these issues too, but what were they? Here's another interesting question. Why is it that in the current decade, the Chinese government generally is more trusting of a Qigong practice that is embedded in a martial arts than if it is practiced on its own spiritual, religious, or even neutral space. How did the martial arts come to be seen as the control for religious exuberance? By better understanding the complex ways in which these forces have interacted in the past, we will undoubtedly give ourselves better tools for understanding what is going on presently, and perhaps give us an idea of where things may be headed into the future. This has been an extraordinarily informative series for me and a hope for you. I learned a great deal about Sun Lu Tang during this research, confirmation of the research, and interpretation phases of this podcast than I would have ever expected. In the very first part of this series, I shared how I was instructed to tear out those pages that connected it to the Taoist philosophy because they would clutter up the mind instead of learning the combative martial arts. And that's kind of what Ben was alluding to there at the end, that you get so caught up in mental jargon and philosophy that you forget how to practice your objectives, your techniques, and carrying out your applications with the amount of power appropriate to get it done. And I would still stand by that concept. Don't get your head too cluttered up in philosophy so much so that you can't actually practice the martial arts. As we were saying there at the end, good martial arts practice should not be an epiphenomenon of good philosophy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having a philosophical approach to your practice and using your martial arts as a form for health. But when it comes to the combative martial arts, you have to emphasize combative skills, which are both internal and external. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. Thank you so much for joining me and including me as part of your martial arts journey. And during this series, which was 5 episodes long, of Sun Lu Tang, we followed how he began in the martial arts being an abused child, how he met one good teacher that led to another good teacher and another good teacher. So he had a heritage about his martial arts that many couldn't argue that he didn't come from good places. He had some great teachers along the way. His impact, for better or worse sometimes, is an incredible component of the martial arts that we know of today as traditional martial arts. Even though the traditional martial arts, as I think about them, was well before the 1910s. Irregardless of the reasons that you practice martial arts, whether it's for sport, a philosophical way of life, for your health, or you're training to be a practical martial artist and protect your family and yourself, always remember to get out there and to give yourself the skills you need. You have to learn to be intuitive. You have to learn to practice good instinctive training so that you can carry out your objectives. In closing, I want to say thank you to Dr. Ben Junkins over at Kung Fu Tea. Take care of yourself. I hope to see some of you September the 2nd down in Myrtle Beach. And if you want to get more information on that, go to kungfupodcast.com/Shurite. I'll be talking with you again soon.